Tell us about the call you received that day.
Sounded like a welfare concern involving a teenage boy. Officers briefed me on delayed responses at the door and unusual sounds they had heard earlier.
Who was inside the home when you got there?
For the suspect and his younger children, but his behavior had subtle cues that raised concern.
How did you handle the moment when you found the victim?
That moment is something no investigator ever forgets.
Hey everyone, welcome back to The Witness Room. Today we have a very special guest, an experienced law enforcement investigator who was directly involved in one of the most challenging and disturbing cases they've ever encountered.
Thank you for having me.
Can you tell our listeners who you are and your role in this case?
I'm a senior law enforcement investigator with years of experience handling violent crime, missing juveniles, and high-risk domestic cases. My role in this case began as support for patrol officers, but it quickly became clear that my involvement would be far more extensive. I was responsible for evaluating the credibility of statements being made at the scene, identifying behavioral red flags, coordinating the search of the residence, and later overseeing key interviews that helped uncover what had actually taken place. In situations like this, my job isn't limited to collecting facts. It's about reading people, environments, and inconsistencies that don't immediately show up in reports. Every decision has to balance urgency with caution, especially when children are involved and the suspect has professional training. From the moment I became involved, I understood that this case would require close attention to detail, emotional control, and the willingness to confront a very uncomfortable truth hiding behind a seemingly normal setting.
Can you tell us about the call you received that day?
The call came in as what initially sounded like a welfare concern involving a teenage boy whose whereabouts were unclear. On paper, it didn't immediately indicate a violent crime, but several details stood out right away. There were ongoing family disputes, prior legal restrictions between adults in the household, and conflicting accounts about when the child had last been seen. Those factors significantly raise concern because they suggest instability and possible deception. When dispatch updated us that officers on scene were hearing unexplained noises inside the home and were having difficulty getting a clear response, the situation escalated quickly. Calls like this are dangerous because they evolve fast. What starts as a missing person can become a crime scene without warning. As I responded, I began mentally preparing for multiple outcomes, knowing that time, careful observation, and restraint would be critical. Experience has taught me that cases involving children rarely unfold exactly as described, and when the information doesn't align, something serious is usually being hidden.
What was your initial impression when you arrived at the residence?
When I arrived at the residence, my first impression was that something didn't feel right, even before I stepped inside. From the outside, the home appeared quiet and ordinary, which often creates a false sense of normalcy. Inside, however, there was a noticeable heaviness, an unnatural calm that didn't match the seriousness of the situation. Officers briefed me on delayed responses at the door and unusual sounds they had heard earlier, which immediately raised concern. As an investigator, you learn to observe everything: how people move, where they stand, what they avoid looking at. The atmosphere felt controlled, almost staged, as if someone was trying very hard to manage how the situation appeared. Those first moments are critical because they often reveal more than any statement. My instincts told me this was not a misunderstanding or a simple family dispute, but the beginning of something far more serious unfolding behind closed doors.
Who was inside the home when you got there?
Inside the home were the suspect and his younger children, and that immediately shaped how we approached the scene. Having children present changes every decision. Your priority shifts between investigating the crime and ensuring their immediate safety and emotional well-being. The suspect tried to present himself as cooperative, speaking confidently and framing the situation as routine, but his behavior had subtle cues that raised concern. The children, on the other hand, were visibly frightened, withdrawn, and hyper-aware of our movements. Their silence, body language, and reactions revealed more than any words could. In my experience, children often provide indirect clues through fear or hesitation, and even small gestures can indicate exposure to something traumatic. From the moment I saw them, I knew the events that had taken place inside this seemingly ordinary home had affected multiple lives, and that gaining their trust would be essential for understanding what had really happened.
How did the children respond when you began asking questions?
The children's responses were subtle but telling. They didn't speak much at first, but their behavior spoke volumes. One child avoided eye contact entirely, while another fidgeted nervously, stopping mid-sentence whenever the suspect was nearby. Their reactions reflected fear, confusion, and a deep awareness of the tension in the house. In many investigations, children reveal critical information through nonverbal cues. Small gestures, hesitations, or expressions can confirm or contradict what adults are saying. Observing them required patience, sensitivity, and careful questioning, because their trust could be easily broken. Their reactions ultimately became one of the most crucial guides in piecing together the events that had taken place inside the home.
Did anything strike you as unusual during your first observations?
Absolutely. From the moment I entered, several details set off warning signals. The suspect's calmness felt rehearsed, almost artificial, as if he was carefully performing for the officers rather than responding naturally. He referenced policies and procedures repeatedly, not out of concern for legality, but in a way that suggested he was trying to control the narrative. Small inconsistencies in his statements didn't add up to anything obvious at first, but combined with his body language, pacing, and attempts to redirect attention, they painted a picture of someone hiding something. Another subtle but important detail was the children's behavior. Their nervousness and avoidance suggested they had seen or experienced something traumatic. In cases like this, the environment, the people, and their interactions all provide clues. Individually, these signals might seem minor, but together they were unmistakable. There was more going on in this house than anyone was willing to admit.
Can you describe your interaction with the suspect?
My interaction with the suspect was tense and calculated from the start. He spoke carefully, almost like he was testing the limits of what he could say without revealing too much. At times, he tried to establish a connection, referencing shared experiences or training in law enforcement, which felt like an attempt to gain trust or influence how we perceived him. In my experience, someone who is more focused on managing perception than helping find a missing child is often concealing critical information. Reading him required balancing observation, patience, and strategy, pushing carefully without escalating tension, knowing that every reaction could provide a clue to the truth he was trying to hide.
How did the suspect react when you started searching the house?
Once the search began, the suspect's demeanor shifted noticeably. Initially calm and cooperative, he became restless, pacing frequently and asking unnecessary questions, attempting to redirect attention away from certain rooms. It wasn't concern for legality or procedure, it was clear he was emotionally reactive, trying to maintain control as we approached areas he wanted to keep hidden. Each step closer to the upper floors increased his agitation, his eyes darting and hands fidgeting as if anticipating discovery. In my experience, suspects often reveal their guilt through subtle cues before any evidence is even found. Observing him required a balance of assertiveness and patience. We had to maintain control without provoking escalation, while still following the protocol that would ultimately uncover the truth hiding behind the walls of that home.
What led you to the third floor and the loft area?
Several factors guided us to the third floor and the loft. First, there were subtle inconsistencies in the suspect's statements that didn't match the timeline or the layout of the house. Officers had also reported unusual noises from the upper level, which couldn't be ignored. Small, overlooked clues in the home items slightly out of place, footprints and indications of recent activity in areas that should have been untouched. Investigators learned to trust these instincts. Physical evidence alone rarely tells the whole story. By following the signs, interviewing witnesses, and observing behavioral cues, we systematically narrowed in on the space where the child had been hidden. That moment is always tense because the anticipation of what you may find adds a psychological weight to the search itself.
How did you handle the moment when you found the victim?
That moment is something no investigator ever forgets. When we discovered the victim in the loft, the initial reaction was a mix of shock, urgency, and heartbreak. Training takes over, you immediately assess the situation, attempt life-saving measures, and call for medical support. But emotionally, it's devastating, especially when the victim is a child. There's a brief window where hope battles reality, and you do everything within your power to reverse the outcome. That instant between discovery and understanding is heavy. The weight of knowing what has happened and what it means for everyone involved is almost impossible to shake.
Did the suspect resist arrest? And how challenging was it given his training?
Yes, the suspect resisted arrest, and it was a significant challenge because of his law enforcement training. He understood leverage, positioning, and how to exploit hesitation, which made the situation far more dangerous than a standard apprehension. From the moment we tried to secure him, he fought against our control, attempting to manipulate openings and test our coordination. Restraining someone with that knowledge requires multiple officers working in perfect sync while constantly monitoring potential threats. It's tense, physically demanding, and mentally exhausting. You can't let frustration or fear dictate your actions. Every decision has to prioritize safety, yours, the other officers, and everyone else present while ensuring the suspect is taken into custody without further harm or escalation.
What safety measures do you follow when restraining a potentially dangerous individual?
When restraining someone who is potentially dangerous, especially a suspect trained in law enforcement, every action must be deliberate and controlled. We use multiple officers to maintain leverage and prevent sudden movements, communicate constantly with clear, firm commands, and maintain full awareness of any potential weapon access points. There is no room for assumption. We operate under the mindset that the individual knows every technique we're using and could exploit the smallest mistake. Our priority is to neutralize the threat while preventing harm to the suspect, officers, or anyone else nearby. Mental preparation is just as important as physical coordination. We must remain calm, anticipate escalation, and stay vigilant. In situations like these, discipline, teamwork, and constant assessment of the suspect's behavior are what allow us to gain control safely, even under extreme pressure.
How did interviews with the children and the ex-partner help your investigation?
The interviews with the children and the ex-partner were critical in piecing together the true sequence of events. The ex-partner provided context about prior disputes, the dynamics within the home, and behaviors that, in hindsight, explained patterns we observed during the search. The children, though young and initially hesitant, revealed fragments of information that corroborated each other and the physical evidence. Even small details like the way rooms were accessed, items being hidden, or specific instructions the children were given became vital clues. These interviews filled gaps that evidence alone could not explain, helping us understand not just what happened, but why. Handling these interviews required patience, sensitivity, and careful questioning to avoid re-traumatizing them. Yet their input ultimately allowed the investigation to move from suspicion to clarity, confirming what had been deliberately concealed.
What kind of evidence or clues helped you piece the story together?
It was the combination of physical evidence, behavioral observations, timelines, and witness accounts that ultimately revealed the full story. Small details like items out of place, inconsistencies in the suspect's statements, and subtle cues from the children began to form a pattern. Physical indicators, such as signs of activity in spaces that should have been untouched, helped confirm suspicions raised by our interviews. Each clue on its own might not have been decisive, but when layered together, they painted a clear narrative of concealment and manipulation. In investigations like this, you rely on the convergence of multiple sources to build certainty, because a single piece of evidence can be misinterpreted. Watching all the pieces align, seeing statements and observations reinforce each other, is when the truth becomes undeniable, and it's also when the weight of what happened fully hits you.
Was this case different from others you've investigated in terms of difficulty or emotional impact?
Yes, this case was profoundly different and exceptionally difficult. Cases involving minors are always sensitive, but this one carried additional layers of betrayal and complexity. The suspect was a trained law enforcement officer, which made controlling the scene and assessing risk far more challenging. The concealment of the crime inside a home, combined with the presence of younger children who had been exposed to trauma, created an emotional intensity that's hard to describe. Every step required extreme caution, balancing investigative procedure with the psychological well-being of witnesses. The combination of professional deception, family dynamics, and the horrific outcome made it emotionally taxing for everyone involved. Unlike many cases where evidence and interviews gradually build the story, here the emotional impact was immediate, and the moral weight of what had happened lingered long after the investigation concluded.
Looking back, what do you think is the most important lesson from this case for law enforcement and the public?
The most important lesson from this case is that authority and trust are never substitutes for vigilance and accountability. Even someone trained to protect others can become a source of harm, and signs of abuse or concealment must never be ignored, no matter how uncomfortable it is to confront them. For law enforcement, it reinforces the necessity of observing behavioral cues, corroborating statements, and relying on evidence over appearances. For the public, it is a reminder to pay attention, ask questions, and not assume that someone's position or status guarantees safety. When children are involved, silence or hesitation can be as dangerous as action. This case underscores that awareness, diligence, and courage to face the truth are critical, both in policing and in everyday life, because the cost of turning a blind eye is often irreparable.
Thank you so much for sharing your experience and insights with us today. Your perspective really helps us understand not just the facts of the case, but also the challenges and responsibilities investigators face behind the scenes. It's been both eye-opening and deeply moving.
Thanks for giving me the space to explain what really happened. I'm glad the story could be shared.
Our listeners, if you found this episode compelling, make sure to subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and share this story with anyone interested in true crime investigations. We'll be back soon with another story that dives deep into the real challenges, mysteries, and lessons from true crime. Thanks again to our guest, and thank you all for listening. Take care and see you next time.